Samir and Malik woke before dawn, his heart pounding in his chest. Today was the day they would leave everything behind, the city that had been their home, the memories of their lives before the war, and the hope that things might one day return to normal. His wife, Leila, stirred beside him, and for a moment, he let his gaze linger on her face, worn with worry, but still the source of his strength. Their two children, Amir and Yara, were still fast asleep, their breathing steady in the quiet, pre-dawn darkness. They had no choice but to leave. The war had taken everything: Samir's job as a schoolteacher, Leila's work as a nurse, the children's laughter, and the peace that once filled their home. Now, only the sound of distant explosions and the sight of soldiers patrolling the streets remained. Samir sighed as he rose from his bed, careful not to wake Leila. They had a long journey ahead, and every moment counted. He moved silently across the small room, gathering the few belongings they could carry. Each item he placed in the bag felt like a piece of their old life being left behind. He glanced at a faded photograph of the family, taken just before the war began. The smiles in the picture seemed like distant echoes of a time long gone. His fingers brushed against the frame for a brief second before he placed it gently in the bag. Samir, Leila's voice was a soft whisper, and she sat up, rubbing her eyes. She glanced around the room, taking in the packed bags and the weight of what lay ahead. "Is it time?" Samir nodded. "We need to go before the sun comes up." Leila stood, her movements slow and deliberate, as if every action carried the burden of their decision. She moved to wake the children, placing a gentle hand on Amir's shoulder first. The 12-year-old boy stirred, blinking as he took in the scene before him. His brown eyes, once so full of curiosity, now carried a weight beyond his years. "Is today the day, Baba?" Amir asked quietly, his voice betraying the fear he tried to hide. "Yes, son," Samir replied, his voice steady but filled with the same uncertainty that gripped them all. "We leave today." Yara, the youngest, was still asleep, her small body curled into the corner of the mattress. Leila knelt beside her, brushing a strand of tangled hair from her daughter's face. At 6 years old, Yara didn't fully understand what was happening. To her, this journey was more of an adventure than an escape from the horrors around them. She woke with a smile, stretching her arms as if ready for another day of play. "Are we going on the trip, Mama?" she asked, her voice bright and innocent. Leila nodded, forcing a smile for her daughter's sake. "Yes, my love. It's time for our adventure." The family gathered their bags, moving through their home one last time. Each step felt heavy, like the final moments of a life they would never return to. Samir paused at the door, his hand resting on the worn wood as he took a deep breath. He wanted to remember this place, not the war-torn shell it had become, but the home it once was. With one last glance, he opened the door, leading his family into the unknown. The streets were eerily silent, the once bustling neighborhood now a wasteland of crumbled buildings and abandoned homes. Samir kept his family close, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. The soldiers patrolled randomly, and one wrong move could mean their capture or worse. As they moved through the city, Amir lagged behind for a moment, his gaze drawn to something on the ground. Samir turned, his heart pounding as he saw his son kneeling in the dust, holding a small, broken toy. It was a soldier, one of the plastic figures Amir used to play with before the war, now abandoned by some other family who had fled before them. Amir stared at the toy for a long moment before placing it gently back on the ground. "Do you think they made it, Baba?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Samir placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his heart heavy with the unspoken answer. "I don't know, Amir, but we need to keep moving." They pressed on, ducking into alleyways and avoiding the main roads, their footsteps silent against the rubble beneath their feet. Every corner held the potential for danger, and the distant rumble of gunfire served as a constant reminder that they were far from safe. At the edge of the city, they reached the final checkpoint. Soldiers, their faces hard and unyielding, stood guard, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Samir's heart raced as they approached, his mind spinning with the lies he might need to tell to get his family through. "Where are you going?" one of the soldiers barked, his eyes narrowing as he looked over the family. Samir forced a calm expression, handing over their identification papers. "We're heading to the countryside to stay with family." "It's safer there," he said, his voice steady despite the fear tightening his chest. The soldier eyed him suspiciously, glancing at Leila and the children. Amir, sensing the tension, stepped forward, his small voice breaking the silence. "Are we going to see the animals on the farm, Baba?" he asked innocently. The soldier's gaze softened slightly, the edge of his suspicion dulling as he handed the papers back. "Move along," he muttered, waving them through. Samir let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding as they passed the checkpoint. The city was behind them now, but the road ahead was long and dangerous. As they moved into the desolate countryside, the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. They walked for hours, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on them. Amir and Yara began to lag, their steps slowing with each passing mile. Leila shared the last of their water, her eyes filled with worry as she looked at their children. "We need to find shelter," Samir said, scanning the horizon. "We can't keep walking all night." They found refuge in an abandoned farmhouse, its roof partially collapsed but still offering enough shelter from the elements. Inside, they huddled together, their breaths shallow with fatigue. Samir and Leila exchanged a quiet glance, the unspoken fears weighing heavily between them. "Do you think we'll make it?" Leila asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We have to," Samir replied, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. "For them." As night fell, the distant sound of gunfire echoed in the darkness, a reminder that the war was never far behind. Samir stayed awake, watching over his family, his hand gripping the small knife he had brought for protection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, they had each other, and that was enough. The sun hung low as the Malik family descended into the valley. After days of walking through barren landscapes and navigating dangerous terrain, the sight of the village nestled between the mountains felt almost unreal. It was like a mirage, stone houses dotting the landscape, smoke curling from chimneys, and green fields stretching beyond the edges of the village. For a moment, Samir could almost believe they had finally found peace. Yara, clutching her mother's hand, skipped forward, her small legs energized by the sight of the village. "Look, Mama, there are flowers," she squealed, pointing to a patch of wildflowers growing along the path. Leila smiled down at her daughter, though the weariness in her eyes remained. The journey had taken its toll on them all, but for Yara, this place held a magic that even the shadows of war could not fully erase. "Let's not get too excited just yet," Samir cautioned, his voice low. He glanced at Amir, who walked beside him with a cautious expression. "We don't know what kind of welcome we'll get." Amir nodded, his gaze fixed on the village ahead. He was old enough to understand that safety was never guaranteed. The war had taught him that much. Still, The sight of a village that seemed untouched by the conflict gave him a small spark of hope, one he tried to keep hidden beneath his cautious exterior. As they approached the first house, a figure emerged from one of the doorways, a woman, elderly but standing tall, her sharp blue eyes fixed on the approaching family. Samir tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for Leila's arm. The woman took a few steps toward them, her long silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, her weathered face unreadable. "Who are you?" she called, her voice carrying over the quiet of the valley. Samir stepped forward, his heart racing. "We are refugees," he said, his voice steady but measured. "We've come from the city. We've been traveling for days. We're looking for a place to rest." The woman's gaze flickered over each of them, lingering for a moment on Amir and Yara. Her expression softened, just barely, and she nodded. "You've come a long way," she said, her tone shifting to something less guarded. "My name is Fatima. This is my home, and the home of many who seek refuge." Leila stepped forward, her eyes filled with quiet desperation. "Please, we don't need much. Just a place to rest for the night." Fatima regarded them for a long moment before nodding again. "Come," she said, turning toward the house. "I will find you a place." Relief washed over Samir, though a knot of suspicion still tightened in his chest. It all seemed too perfect. A village untouched by war, an elderly woman offering them shelter without question. It was everything they needed. Yet something about it felt wrong. The house Fatima led them to was small but well kept, with stone walls and a thatched roof. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the scent of herbs and wood smoke. Fatima showed them to a room with a few simple cots and blankets, the comfort of which seemed luxurious after nights spent on the cold ground. "You can rest here," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I will bring food." As Fatima disappeared, Samir lowered himself onto one of the cots, his body aching with exhaustion. Leila sat beside him, pulling Yara into her lap. Amir stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the village square, where few villagers moved about their tasks, all of them quiet, almost ghost-like in their movements. "This place is different," Amir said after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper. Samir glanced at his son. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Amir replied, frowning. "Everyone is so quiet. Like they're afraid to speak." Leila sighed, running her hand through Yara's tangled hair. "They've probably been through their own horrors, Amir. We can't judge them." "Still," Samir added, his voice thoughtful, "we should be careful." Fatima returned later with a simple meal: bread, vegetables, and a bowl of soup. It was more food than they had seen in days, and though Samir was grateful, the tightness in his chest remained. As they ate, Fatima watched them with a quiet intensity, her eyes flickering with something Samir couldn't quite place. "How long have you been here?" Leila asked, breaking the silence. Fatima's gaze shifted to her. "All my life," she said simply. "This village has been here for generations. We have survived many wars. And you've stayed safe through it all." Samir pressed, unable to keep the suspicion from his voice. Fatima's expression didn't change, but there was a pause before she answered. "We've been fortunate," she said at last, "but safety comes at a cost." A chill ran through Samir, though he wasn't sure why. Fatima's words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken meaning. He opened his mouth to ask more, but Leila touched his arm, her eyes pleading for him to stop. "Thank you for the food," Leila said, her voice gentle. "We're very grateful." Fatima stood, nodding once. "Rest now. You've had a long journey." As she left, Samir watched her go, unease curling in his stomach. Something about this place wasn't right. But for now, they had no choice but to stay. They needed rest, and the children needed safety. Tomorrow, he would learn more about this village. Tomorrow, he would find out what price they might have to pay for the peace it offered. That night, Samir lay awake long after Leila and the children had fallen asleep. Outside, the village was silent, the kind of silence that made every creak and whisper feel like a warning. He listened to the faint rustle of the wind through the trees, the occasional murmur of distant voices. Something was happening in this village, something beneath the surface, hidden from view. Tomorrow, he promised himself, tomorrow he would find the truth. Samir woke early the next morning, long before the sun had fully risen. His mind had not allowed him much rest during the night. The quiet of the village, the way the people seemed to move with an almost forced silence, it unsettled him. There was something unspoken in the air, and he could feel it pressing down on him like an invisible weight. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this place than what met the eye. He sat up on his cot, the room still dark, save for the soft glow of the POE dawn light creeping through the window. Leila was still asleep beside him, her breathing slow and steady, while Amir and Yara lay curled up in their own makeshift beds. Samir glanced at his children, his heart aching with a mix of love and fear. They were so young, so innocent, and yet they had already seen so much suffering. He rose quietly, slipping out of the room and into the cool morning air. Outside, the village was still and silent, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the tranquility. Samir's eyes wandered over the stone houses, the narrow paths between them, and the rolling hills beyond the village. It all seemed so peaceful, but peace, he had learned, often came with a price. Determined to uncover more about the place they now found themselves in, Samir made his way through the village, walking slowly, his eyes scanning for anything that seemed out of place. As he passed the central square, he noticed a group of villagers gathered near a large wooden structure, some kind of community hall, it seemed. They spoke in hushed voices, their heads close together, casting furtive glances around as they talked. Samir hesitated, curiosity gnawing at him. He knew better than to approach them directly. Instead, he moved toward the hall itself, keeping a careful distance. The building, though small, looked important, more well-maintained than the other houses in the village, with thick wooden beams and stone walls that suggested it had been standing for many years. Samir's heart pounded as he circled around the back of the hall, slipping quietly into the shadows. He was taking a risk, but he had to know more. If they were going to stay in this village, if they were going to put their trust in these people, he needed to understand what was happening beneath the surface. There, at the back of the hall, he found a door, slightly ajar. His pulse quickened. Glancing around to make sure no one was watching, he slipped inside. The interior of the hall was dimly lit, the only light coming from the faint rays of the rising sun filtering through the small windows. The room was empty, save for a few wooden benches and tables scattered about. But what caught Samir's attention was the large, heavy door on the far side of the room. It was old, made of thick wood reinforced with iron bands, and it looked as though it hadn't been opened in years. Something about that door called to him, a quiet warning in the back of his mind telling him to turn back. But Samir couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay behind it held the answers he was looking for. He crossed the room, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor, and reached for the door's iron handle. It was cold to the touch, and for a moment, Samir hesitated. But then, with a deep breath, he pulled the door open. There inside the small room beyond was musty, thick with the scent of dust and age. It was a storeroom of sorts, filled with old crates and boxes stacked haphazardly. But what drew Samir's attention was a stack of faded documents on a small table in the corner. Papers, old and yellowed with time, lay scattered across the surface. He moved closer, picking up one of the sheets, his eyes scanning the faded writing. At first, the words didn't make sense to him, but as he read further, a cold knot of dread began to form in his chest. These were records, lists of names, dates, places, and they were tied to the war. Samir's hands trembled as he sifted through the documents. It became clear that this village wasn't as untouched by the conflict as it seemed. These papers revealed a dark truth: a secret alliance with both sides of the war, trading their cooperation for protection. The villagers had turned a blind eye to atrocities in exchange for their own safety. It explained everything: the eerie silence, the unspoken tension in the air. They were complicit in something terrible. A noise behind him made Samir freeze. He turned sharply to find Fatima standing in the doorway, her sharp blue eyes fixed on him. She didn't look surprised to find him there. In fact, there was a certain resignation in her gaze, as if she had been expecting this moment. "You found them," she said quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. Samir swallowed, his throat dry. "What is this?" he demanded, though he already knew the answer. How could this village?" Fatima stepped into the room, her movements slow and deliberate. "We did what we had to do," she said, her voice steady. "We made choices to survive. At what cost?" Samir asked, his voice shaking with anger. "You've betrayed everything: your people, your morals, everything you stood for." Fatima's eyes softened, just barely. "It's not that simple," she said. "War changes everything. You can't understand what it was like, the choices we had to make. We kept our village safe, but we lost a part of ourselves in the process. This was the price of peace." Samir shook his head, his mind reeling. He had thought they had found safety here, a refuge from the horrors of the war. But now he realized that this village was built on lies and compromise, on the suffering of others. "You need to leave this alone," Fatima warned, her voice low. "If you stir this up, if you try to expose the truth, it will destroy everything. This village has survived because we've kept our secrets." Samir's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could leave it alone, stay quiet, and keep his family safe. Or he could speak out, expose the truth, and risk everything. For now, he nodded, his mind spinning with the weight of what he had uncovered. But deep down, he knew that staying silent would be the hardest decision of all. Samir stood at the threshold of their small home, his mind a tangled web of confusion and fear. Fatima's words still echoed in his ears, her warning that uncovering the village's dark past would only lead to destruction. But how could he live with this knowledge, knowing that the peace they had found was built on the suffering of others? His eyes scanned the village, now bathed in the soft glow of the early evening, the sounds of people quietly going about their lives. It all seemed so normal, so serene. But beneath the surface, the village was a ticking time bomb, and Samir had no idea how long they had before everything exploded. Leila sensed his turmoil and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Samir," she said softly, "you need to tell me what's going on." He looked at her, his chest tightening with the weight of what he had to reveal. She had been his anchor throughout this ordeal, the one who kept him grounded when he felt like the world was slipping away. But now, as he prepared to shatter the fragile piece they had found, he wondered if she would still stand by him. "I found something," Samir began, his voice low and strained. "The village." "It's not what it seems," Leila frowned, her dark eyes narrowing in concern. "What do you mean?" Samir took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he explained everything about the documents he had found, the secret deals the village had made with both sides of the war, and the unspeakable acts they had allowed to happen in exchange for their own safety. Leila's face grew pale as he spoke, her hand tightening around his arm as the reality of their situation began to sink in. "They betrayed everything," Samir said, his voice trembling with anger. "All for peace." Leila was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward their children, who were playing quietly in the corner of the room. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samir swallowed hard. "I don't know, but we can't stay here. Not anymore." Leila's eyes filled with fear as she looked back at him. "But where will we go? We barely survived the journey to get here, Samir." "The children, they're so young." "I don't know if they can handle another escape." Samir's heart ached with the truth of her words. Leaving the village meant stepping back into a world full of danger, of soldiers and violence, with no guarantee of finding another safe haven. But staying meant accepting a life built on lies and betrayal, and Samir wasn't sure if he could live with that. Before he could respond, a soft knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Samir froze, his heart racing. Who could it be? Had someone discovered what he had found? He motioned for Leila to take the children into the back room, his body tense as he approached the door. When he opened it, Fatima stood on the other side, her expression grim but calm. She didn't wait for an invitation before stepping inside, her eyes locking with Samir's in a silent understanding. "You've made a decision," Fatima said, her voice steady. Samir nodded, his throat tight. "I can't stay here, knowing what this village has done." Fatima sighed, a weariness settling over her features. "I warned you, Samir. Some truths are better left buried, and some truths need to be told." Samir shot back, his anger rising again. Fatima's gaze softened, a hint of sorrow in her eyes. "You don't understand what it's like to survive a war. This village, these people, they've done what they had to do. It's not pretty, but it kept us alive. At what cost?" Samir demanded, his voice rising. "How many people suffered so that this village could live in peace?" Fatima's lips pressed into a thin line. "More than you ever know." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of the unspoken hanging between them. Samir felt torn, the lines between right and wrong blurring in ways he had never experienced before. He wanted to believe there was still a moral clarity in the world, that they could live in peace without betraying their values. But the war had changed everything, twisting even the best intentions into something unrecognizable. "What are you going to do?" Fatima asked quietly. Samir looked at her, his mind racing. He didn't know. For the first time in his life, he truly didn't know what the right answer was. But one thing was certain, they couldn't stay in this village any longer. Not after everything he had uncovered. "We're leaving," he said at last, his voice firm. Fatima nodded, though her expression remained somber. "And you'll take the truth with you?" Samir hesitated. He could expose the village's dark past, reveal the secrets they had buried for so long. But what would that accomplish? Would it bring justice to those who had suffered? Or would it simply destroy the fragile peace that had kept these people alive? I won't say anything, Samir said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. But we can't stay here. Fatima studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. I understand. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle. You're not the first family to make this choice, she said softly. And you won't be the last. With that, she slipped out into the night, leaving Samir standing in the middle of the room, the echoes of her words lingering in the air. He had made his decision, but the road ahead was still uncertain. Leila reappeared from the back room, her eyes filled with questions. What did she say? We're leaving, Samir repeated, though the words felt heavier this time. We'll go at first light. Leila nodded, though fear still flickered in her eyes. Do you think we'll find another place like this? Samir shook his head slowly. I don't know, but we'll keep moving. We'll keep surviving. As they began to pack their belongings, Samir's mind raced with thoughts of the journey ahead. The village, with all its dark secrets, was behind them now. But the cost of peace, the weight of survival, would follow them wherever they went. The morning arrived with a thick fog hanging low over the valley, shrouding the village in an eerie stillness. Samir's heart raced as he quietly moved through the small house, gathering the few belongings they had left. He had barely slept, his mind constantly returning to the danger they now faced. They had to leave before the village woke, before anyone could stop them. Leila was already awake, standing by the door with Amir and Yara, their faces pale in the dim light. The children were silent, sensing the tension in the air. They had been through so much already, and Samir hated the thought of putting them through more. But staying wasn't an option anymore. We'll head through the forest, Samir whispered to Leila, glancing out the window. It's the only way we can avoid being seen. Leila nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. Do you think they'll come after us? Samir hesitated. I don't know. But we can't take any chances. He motioned for the children to stay close as they slipped out of the house, the cold air biting against their skin. The fog provided some cover as they moved toward the edge of the village, but Samir knew it wouldn't last long. Every sound, every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves felt like a signal to the villagers that they were escaping. As they reached the tree line, Samir stopped for a moment, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He scanned the village behind them, half expecting to see someone coming after them. But the village remained quiet, as if it hadn't yet stirred from its slumber. Let's go, he said, his voice firm but low. They plunged into the forest, the thick canopy overhead blocking out what little light had begun to creep through the fog. The ground was uneven, and Yara stumbled a few times, but Amir stayed close to her, holding her hand to steady her. Samir glanced back at them, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and sorrow. His children had been forced to grow up too quickly, and it was all because of this war. The deeper they went into the forest, the more the weight of the village began to lift from Samir's shoulders. But the uncertainty of the road ahead pressed down on him just as heavily. They had no plan, no destination in mind. All they could do was keep moving, hoping to find safety somewhere anywhere far from the lies they had left behind. Hours passed, and the forest seemed to close in around them. The fog had lifted, but the trees were dense, casting long shadows on the ground. Samir kept his ears attuned to any sound, any sign that they were being followed. But the only sounds were the steady rustling of leaves and the occasional bird overhead. Leila walked beside him, her face set in a determined expression, though he could see the weariness in her eyes. She had been his strength throughout this ordeal, and now, as they fled into the unknown, he knew he couldn't have made it this far without her. Suddenly, a noise behind them broke the quiet, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping. Samir stopped in his tracks, his heart leaping into his throat. He motioned for Leila and the children to crouch down, pulling them behind a thick cluster of bushes. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving through the forest behind them. Samir's pulse quickened as he peeked through the branches, trying to catch a glimpse of who or what was following them. A figure emerged from the trees, Samir's breath caught in his throat. It was one of the villagers, an older man, carrying a rifle slung over his shoulder. Samir tensed, his mind racing. Had they been caught? Were the villagers hunting them down? But the man didn't appear to be searching for them. His eyes were fixed ahead, and he moved with a sense of purpose, though not in their direction. Samir watched as the man passed by, his steps steady and unhurried. When the man was out of sight, Samir let out a slow breath, his muscles relaxing slightly. He turned to Leila, who was watching him with wide eyes. "Do you think he saw us?" she whispered. Samir shook his head. "I don't think so, but we need to keep moving." They rose from their hiding place and continued deeper into the forest, their pace quickening. Samir's mind raced with thoughts of the villager they had seen. Was he patrolling the area? Were others out here too, waiting to catch them? As they pressed on, the forest began to thin, and soon they found themselves at the edge of a wide, open field. Beyond it, the land sloped upward into a range of rocky hills. Samir stopped, his eyes scanning the landscape ahead. It wasn't much, but it offered them some cover, and if they could reach the hills, they might be able to lose anyone who followed them. "We'll head for the hills," Samir said, pointing toward the rocky terrain in the distance. "If we can make it there, we'll be harder to find." Leila nodded, though exhaustion weighed heavy on her. Amir and Yara followed closely, their small feet dragging as they crossed the open field. Samir kept his eyes on the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. They reached the base of the hills just as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. Samir knew they couldn't stop yet, not until they were well hidden. He led them up the rocky slope, careful to avoid the loose stones that threatened to give way beneath their feet. At last, they found a small cave nestled into the side of the hill. It wasn't much, but it would provide them with shelter for the night. Samir guided the family inside, his body aching with fatigue. As they settled in, he allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had made it this far, and for now, they were safe. But as night fell and the stars appeared in the sky, Samir knew their journey was far from over. The road to freedom stretched ahead of them, uncertain and dangerous, but it was the only road they had left. Tangible ADJ, perceptible by touch or clear and definite. Explanation, something that can be physically touched or clearly understood. Example, the fear in the room was almost tangible, making it hard to breathe. Trepidation, noun, a feeling of fear or anxiety about something that may happen. Explanation, the emotion of being anxious or uncertain about an upcoming event. Example, Samir felt a wave of trepidation as they approached the final checkpoint. Furtive ADJ, attempting to avoid notice or attention, typically because of guilt or a belief that discovery would lead to trouble. Explanation, something done secretly or in a sneaky way to avoid being noticed. Example, Amir gave a furtive glance toward the soldier, hoping not to be seen. Resignation, now the acceptance of something undesirable but inevitable. Explanation, giving in or accepting something reluctantly without protest. Example, with quiet resignation, Samir gathered their bags, knowing they had no choice but to leave. Imposing ADJ, grand and impressive in appearance. Explanation, something that appears large, powerful, or intimidating. Example, the imposing figure of the soldier blocked their path as they approached the checkpoint. Innocuous ADJ, not harmful or offensive. Explanation, describes something that is harmless or not likely to cause offense. Example, Yara's innocent question seemed innocuous, but it helped ease the soldier's suspicion. Reprieve, noun, a temporary escape from an undesirable situation. Explanation, a brief relief from something challenging or unpleasant. Example, the abandoned farmhouse offered a much-needed reprieve from the harsh journey. Incessant ADJ, continuing without pause or interruption. Explanation, something ongoing or relentless. Example, the incessant sound of distant gunfire was a reminder that danger was never far away. Thank you for following along with this emotional journey of Samir and his family as they fled the ashes of their past and faced the uncertain road ahead. Did you enjoy this story? Was it easy to follow and understand in English? I hope it helped you feel more comfortable with the language. If you'd like to keep improving your understanding, I encourage you to watch more stories from this channel. There's so much more to discover, and each one will help you learn new words and expressions in English. At the end of this video, there will be a suggestion for another great story to continue your learning journey. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope to see you again in our next story.